the willingness to question everything. As I often tell my own students, I do not present my teachings as statements of truth, because trying to put the truth into words is a fool's game. It's the approach we often take before awakening. We conceptualize the truth and then believe the concept. So rather than teaching some sort of theology or philosophy, I present my teachings as strategies. I am offering you strategies for awakening and strategies to help you with what happens after awakening. All of the words I use are intended as pointers. In Zen there is a saying, "Don't mistake the finger pointing to the moon for the moon itself." Even though we may hear that 100 times, we still have a tendency to make the mistake over and over. So while I use a lot of words, set certain contexts, and use certain metaphors, I ask you to help. I ask you to keep in mind that everything I am teaching must be awakened to. It must be lived for it to be real. Nothing I say substitutes for the real, direct experience of knowing what you truly are. You need to be willing to question everything, to stop and ask yourself, do I really know what I think I know? Or have I just taken on the beliefs and opinions of others? What do I actually know, and what do I want to believe or imagine? What do I know for certain? This one question, what do I know for certain, is tremendously powerful. When you look deeply into this question, it actually destroys your world. It destroys your whole sense of self, and it's meant to. You come to see that everything you think you know about yourself, everything you think you know about the world, is based on assumptions, beliefs, and opinions. Things you believe because you were taught or told that they were true. Until we start to see these false perceptions for what they really are, consciousness will be imprisoned within the dream state. In the same way, as soon as we allow ourselves to realize, my gosh, I know almost nothing. I don't know who I am. I don't know what the world is. I don't know if it is true. I don't know if that is true. Something within our being opens up. When we are willing to step into the unknown and its inherent insecurity and not run back to anything for cover or comfort, when we are willing to stand as if facing an oncoming wind and not wince, we can finally face our actual self. Investigating the question, what do I know for certain, is also an invaluable tool once awakening has happened. Asking yourself this question aids in the dissolution of limitations and ideas, as well as the tendency to fixate, all of which continue after awakening. No matter where you are on the path, then it's the willingness to stand up within yourself and ask this question, and to be open and sincere about what you find. That is the most important thing. It is the backbone of which the entirety of your awakening and your life after awakening depends. Chapter 2: Authentic Awakening and the Disorientation that can follow. Most of what we are told about awakening sounds like a sales pitch for enlightenment. In a sales pitch, we are told only the most positive aspects. We may even be told things that are not actually true. In the sales pitch of awakening, we are told that enlightenment is all about love and ecstasy, compassion and union, and a host of other positive experiences. It is often shrouded in fantastic stories, so we come to believe that awakening has to do with miracles and mystical powers. One of the most common sales pitches includes describing enlightenment as an experience of bliss. As a result, people think, when I spiritually awaken, when I have a union with God, I will enter into a state of constant ecstasy. This is, of course, a deep misunderstanding of what awakening is. There may be bliss with awakening, but it is actually a byproduct of awakening, but it is not awakening itself. As long as we are chasing the byproducts of awakening, we will miss the real thing. And this is the problem. because many spiritual practices attempt to reproduce the byproducts of awakening without giving rise to the awakening itself. We can learn certain meditative techniques, chanting mantras or singing bhajans, for example, and certain positive experiences will be produced. The human consciousness is tremendously pliable, and by taking part in certain spiritual practices, techniques, and disciplines, you can indeed produce many of the byproducts of awakening, states of bliss, openness, and so on. But what often happens is that you end up with only the byproducts of awakening, without the awakening itself. It is important that we know what awakening is not, so that we no longer chase the byproducts of awakening. We must give up the pursuit of positive emotional states through spiritual practice. The path of awakening is not about positive emotions. On the contrary, enlightenment may not be easy or positive at all. It is not easy to have our illusions crushed. It is not easy to let go of our long-held perceptions. We may experience great resistance to seeing through even those illusions that cause us a great amount of pain. This is something many people don't know they're signing up for when they start on a quest for spiritual awakening. As a teacher, one of the things that I find out about students relatively early on is whether they are interested in the real thing. Do they really want the truth, or do they actually just want to feel better? Because the process of finding the truth may not be a process where we feel increasingly better and better. It may be a process where we need to look at things honestly, sincerely, truthfully, and that may not be an easy thing to do. The sincere call from reality to reality, the sincere call to awaken, is a call that comes from a very deep place within us. It comes from a place that wants the truth more than it wants to feel good. If our orientation is simply to feel better in each moment, then we continue to delude ourselves, because trying to feel better in the moment is exactly how we delude ourselves. We think our delusions are making us feel better. In order to awaken, we must break out of the paradigm of always seeking to feel better. Of course we want to feel better. It's part of the human experience. Everybody wants to feel good. We are hardwired to seek more pleasure and less pain. But there is an even deeper impulse within us, and that is what I describe as the impulse to awaken. It's the impulse to awaken that gives us the courage to look at all the ways in which we deceive ourselves. It is the impulse that calls us to take responsibility for our own lives. We can't get to enlightenment by riding on the coattails of an enlightened teacher. It doesn't work that way. Trying to do that makes us go blind. It means we do not want to think for ourselves. It means we do not want to examine things for ourselves. When we are blindly doing what we are told, blindly following a teaching simply because it is ancient or revered, we end up with just what we are asking for, blindness. Another of the great misunderstandings about awakening or enlightenment is that it is some sort of mystical experience. We might expect an experience akin to union with God, a merging with environment or a dissolving into the ocean. This is not the case, nor is awakening the same as suddenly having a tremendous amount of cosmic insight into the way the whole universe is constructed, insight into the inner workings of what we think is reality. I could go on, but essentially what is important to realize is that spiritual awakening is very different from having a mystical experience. Mystical experiences are beautiful. They are in many ways the highest and most pleasurable experiences that a me can have. The me is always seeking union. Many of the spiritual practices people engage in are actually meant to produce mystical experience of this variety. Whether we're talking about an experience of merging or visions or deities or feeling like our consciousness is expanding through space and time. But again, mystical experiences are not the same as awakening. I'm not saying that mystical experiences have no value, and I'm not saying that they aren't transformative, because they often are. Mystical experiences can change the structure of the egoic self to a radical degree. and often in very positive ways. So in the relative world of things, mystical experiences have a value. But when we are talking about spiritual awakening, we are not talking about personal experience. We are talking about awakening from the me. We are talking about going from one paradigm to a completely different paradigm, from one world to another. I do not mean to imply that someone who is awake does not see the world the same way you see it. I do not mean to imply that someone who is awake does not see the same world you see. Just as you see a chair, someone who is awake sees a chair. You see a car, and someone who is awake sees the car. The difference is that when one is truly awake, when one has gone beyond the veil of duality, things that look different and distinct to everyone else are perceived as essentially the same. We see the chair, and at the same time, we do not see ourselves as separate from the chair. Everything we see, everything we feel, everything we hear is literally a manifestation of the same thing. One of the hallmarks of a true awakening is the end of seeking. With a true and authentic awakening, who and what we are becomes clear. There's no longer a question about it. It's a done deal. In this way, one of the hallmarks of a true awakening is the end of seeking. You no longer feel the momentum and the push and the pull. The seeker has been revealed as the virtual reality it always was, and as such it disappears. The seeker has, in some sense, accomplished its task. It provided the necessary momentum to help propel consciousness or spirit out of its identification with the dream state and helped it return back to its natural state of being. Now, it's the abiding type of awakening, then the seeker and the seeking are completely dissolved. Now, if it's the abiding type of awakening, then the seeker and the seeking are completely dissolved. If, on the other hand, the awakening is a non-abiding character, then the seeker and the seeking may be in the process of being dissolved, but may not be entirely dissolved yet. Either way, this dissolution of the seeker itself can transform one's life. For those on the spiritual path, our whole identity may have been wrapped up in being the seeker. Life may have literally been defined by spiritual seeking, by the yearning for God, or union or enlightenment. Then all of a sudden, awakening happens. The seeker, the seeking, and the whole egoic structure that gets built up around the spiritual quest is suddenly gone. This identity is seen to be what it is, rather meaningless and not useful, and it falls away. The Honeymoon of Awakening. This dropping away of the seeker can be experienced as a huge relief. It marks what I like to call the honeymoon of awakening. At least for me, this dropping away of the seeker and the seeking was experienced as if enormous weight had been taken off my shoulders. It was a very physical experience. I literally felt like weight was being removed, like a weight was removed, a weight I had no idea I'd been carrying. This is a common experience for people upon awakening. At the moment the consciousness wakes up from its dream of separation, there is a great sense of relief. That's why some people will start laughing or crying or have some other sort of deep emotional release. They are feeling the relief of finally being outside of the dream state. I sometimes refer to this moment as the first kiss. Awakening is sort of like your first spiritual kiss. Your first real kiss of reality, your introduction to the truth of who and what you are. The honeymoon may last for a day, a week, 6 months, a couple of years. It varies for different people. What characterizes the honeymoon period is complete flow. There is no resistance in your being, in your experience. Everything is flowing. Life is a flow. Everything just seems to happen on its own volition. It's the experiential knowledge that everything is actually being done, that you as a separate entity aren't doing anything. In the deepest sense, this honeymoon is an experience of a complete and utter non-resistance. Within this non-resistance, life flows wonderfully and beautifully, almost magically. Things show up when they need to show up. Decisions are made without actually deciding them. Everything has a sense of obviousness. It is the experience of spirit, completely unhindered, uncorrupted by illusion, conditioning, or contradiction. This flow may be a momentary experience, or it may last longer. Some people get so swept up in the honeymoon that they become almost incapacitated for a period of time, lost in the bliss state for a week, a month, or even years. In ancient times, people having this experience entered protected environments such as monasteries, places where those around them would understand. They'd be put in a nice little cell and be left alone to let the process happen. They were fortunate to experience awakening in a context in which it was understood, seen as normal, and given the space it required. In today's society, most of us having these realizations are not living in monasteries. We are not in particularly in supportive environments. In fact, in our society, it is possible to have an amazing realization on Saturday and be back in the office on Monday morning. If your mind is still blown out in bliss, this can be very disorientating, yet it's the reality of the situation we live in. Most modern people do not have the luxury of sitting in a cave for a few months and letting things shake down naturally. Just gonna shut the door. This is the state of our world, and it can be a challenge for some people. The disorientation that often occurs after awakening. Whether the honeymoon of awakening lasts a day or a year, at some point one starts to look around and realise that things have changed quite a bit, that which oriented us in our lives is no longer there. The beliefs we grabbed onto and used to define ourselves are now revealed to be empty and without substance. Much of our egoic motivation has disappeared, which can be very disorientating to the mind. It's only at this particular point that people start to realise that almost everything that previously motivated them in life was self-centred. I do not mean that it was a negative or judgmental way. I simply mean that the driving force propelling us through life when we are in the dream state is very self-centred. Our motivations have been fueled by what do I want and what don't I want. We're constantly asking these questions. What can I achieve? Who will love me? How much joy can I get? How much happiness can I get? How much unhappiness can I avoid? Can I get the right job? Can I find the right lover? Will I get enlightened? These are all self-centered motivations in that the energy comes from the egoic state of consciousness. Again, this is not bad or wrong, it's just the way it is. The dream state is the state where we perceive separation, where we think we are a separate entity and a separate being. The separate being is always seeking something: love, approval, success, money, maybe even enlightenment. But with real awakening, that whole structure of separation begins to dissolve under one's feet. There is still a human being there. We don't disappear into a puff of smoke. Even our personality remains intact. Jesus had a personality, Buddha had a personality. Everybody who works on earth has a personality. Infants, when they come out of their mother's wombs, have personalities. It is one of the beauties of being that each of us has a different personality. Dogs and cats, birds, even trees have different personalities. The difference is that once we have seen beyond the veil of separation, identification with our particular personality begins to dissolve. Even if we've seen very deeply and the transformation has been great, there is still a basic personality structure present. But what used to fuel our personality of all of its old orientating principles and self-centered drive has either disappeared or is in the process of disappearing. In my own case, I had my first glimpse beyond the veil when I was 25. It was of a non-abiding variety. It was not a permanent awakening. That said, Something about the realization never left me. Somewhere inside, I always knew that everything was one, that I was eternal, unborn, undying, and uncreated. I understood that my essential nature was not limited or confined to my personality structure or the body I seemed to be inhabiting. There had been a dissolving, in a somewhat radical way, of the world as I had known it, and the self I had known myself to be. It was actually quite odd to be walking around with all of the motivations that previously informed my life. There was still a certain amount of self-centered motivation and egoic-centered energy, but there was also an immense amount of disillusion at the level of ego and at the level of the basic energy force that it derived from ego. I walked around saying to myself, well, why should I do this? Why should I do that? I'm not really motivated to do anything anymore. The things I had previously loved doing didn't hold the same appeal. It was not that I resisted them or hated doing them. It was just that there was an absence of self-centered energy that had previously driven my interest in these particular pursuits. This is not uncommon. People often come to me and say, gee, I used to have all these things I love to do. I used to have hobbies, and I used to like to go for dinner parties. I used to be into kite flying, or running, or whatever it was they had previously enjoyed doing. I tell them that it is common for these interests to start to wane, especially if their interest in the activity had been fueled by the energy of separation. With these interests that are literally expressions of division of ego, it will suddenly seem like, where did they go? If we are spiritual practitioners, one of the things that we hope for is the dissolution of the ego. We recognize the pain of the egoic state, and we hope we won't be confined to it forever. But awakening itself is not the same as egoic dissolving. We can wake up whether the ego has dissolved or not. In fact, very strong and even destructive egos can awaken. Awakening begins the process. The result of the awakening, its fallout or aftermath, is a radical dissolving of ego. This does not mean that the ego will be in cooperation. The ego may resist this dissolution with everything it has. It may bring out the entirety of its arsenal. Nevertheless, the process has begun, and ultimately, once you've had a glimpse of reality, there's nothing you can do to stop the ego from dissolving in time. But this dissolution, when it takes place, can be very disorientating. Awakening itself can be very disorientating. Everything you thought was true, you now see is not. The person you thought you were, you now see you are not. That itself can be blissful and a tremendous relief, and it can simultaneously be experienced as disorientating. Who am I going to be now? What's going to move me? What's going to motivate this human being? Of course, if one is fully awake, one does not have these questions, but that is rare initially. For most people, there is a further process after awakening. So for some people, these questions remain. There are no pat answers that a spiritual teacher can give, because any answer would just be turned into a goal by the ego. What's more useful is to understand that to be disorientated is part of the process of awakening. It is natural to be disorientated because everything is new. You are new. Your perception is new, and your perception of everything and everyone now has changed. The disorientation arises because the mind is struggling to orientate itself in a new context. It's like you're falling out of a plane. If you just let yourself fall, there's no problem. But as soon as you start to grasp at space, as if to find your bearings, you feel very disorientated. You realize you don't know which way is up and which way is down. So disorientation is not necessarily inherent in the awakened view. It arises from the mind trying to find orientation. But one of the keys to the awakened view is that there is no orientation. Reality does not need an orientation. If there is an orientation, it is the orientation of a deep sense of relaxation, of allowing everything to be. Literally, you find your orientation through not trying to find your orientation. You find your orientation by letting go totally. There is a phase in which we let go, and there does not immediately appear to arise in our consciousness a new energy that will move our lives. Of course, this energy exists and is moving through us all the time. It is the energy of non-division. It comes straight from the source, without being distorted. But there's often a gap between the dissolving of our ego motivations and the arising of this energy in our consciousness. So we may go through a period of wondering what new energy will move us along after awakening. Again, what is important is to simply allow the process of egoic dissolution to occur. For most people, this dissolution process will go on for some years. In my case, there was a 6-year period before there was an even deeper realization or awakening. Not essentially different, but much clearer, deeper, and more complete. In order for this deeper realization to happen, a 6-year period of the dissolving of ego was necessary. I can see that looking back, and so I'm not unlike the vast majority of people. After the first glimpse of awakening, we undergo a process that can lead us to a clearer and much deeper perception of reality. That was the end of chapter 2.